I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this Zoom room, which would be in Weiser Hall in any given year. But now we're somewhere in the ether. I'm Johannes von Moltke. I'm the acting director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, which includes the Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies, as well as the Center for European Studies and the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, all of which kind of have a relation to today's topic and speaker. So I'm really delighted to be able to welcome our new colleague, Mackenzie Pierce, who is an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. He got his PhD at Cornell with a prize-winning dissertation that he defended in 2019. His research focuses on the cultural aftermath of World War II among, in particular, Poland's composers, musicologists, and performers. And he's overseen world and US premieres of the works of Roman Polester and Tadeusz Siegfried Kassan, among others, which he brings often in unpublished versions to new audiences. So there's a real spade work that he's doing here for us. He's had articles appear in 19th Century Music, in the Journal of Musicology and the Cambridge Companion to Music and Fascism, and has had his research supported through fellowships from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Polish Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and the Kosciuszko Foundation. I hope that was halfway right, the pronunciation. If you want to find out more about Mackenzie, we'd invite you to go look at his website, which we'll drop in the chat for you to look at. Mackenzie is currently working on a book that right now has the title Life and Death for Music, World War II, the Holocaust, and the Fate of Poland's Composers. And this is what his talk will be drawn from. I'll just say before passing the mic that the Q&A function is open. I'm at this point assuming that everybody's familiar with these things ad nauseum. We're using the Q&A and not the chat. So if you want to ask questions, you can do so during the talk and certainly after the talk. I will be moderating the questions and posing them on your behalf to Mackenzie after he completes his talk. So welcome to the Crease Noon Lecture, such as it is. And we look forward to your talk, Mackenzie.
Hi, everyone in the ether. It's always an interesting experience to feel your presence yet not see your faces across the room. So thanks for everyone for spending their lunch hour with me today. And I'm especially grateful to Crease and the many organizations involved in hosting this talk for the invitation to present this version of a talk, which I gave a slightly longer version of last winter in the musicology department. So hold with me while I go ahead and I share my screen here. All right. Okay. So today I will be discussing the composers who survived the Second World War in Poland and about some of the music that they wrote during the war's aftermath. I'll explore the rise of an emotional, expressive aesthetic during these years, and I'll connect this aesthetic to contemporary ideas about how music could mitigate wartime trauma. Throughout, I will probe the silences and partial articulations of wartime memory and ask what social ends these silences served. The main figures who will guide this discussion are Zygmunt Michalski and Roman Polester. They were born in the first decade of the 20th century, and by the late 1930s, they had established successful musical careers in Poland and were even gaining international recognition. They were certainly not the only musical voices during the post-war period, much less the only post-war voices of significance. But their experiences, writings, and composition cast light on an aesthetic outlook that was significant, perhaps even dominant during these years. Namely, a reluctance to name the toll of war or to explicitly commemorate its losses that was nonetheless joined with the sense that the experiences of war had reshaped the aims of contemporary musical language. The beginnings of the war in 1939 upended the lives of both Michalski and Polester. In September, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland. The Soviets quickly eliminated sources of resistance, but the state also continued to employ musicians through state sponsorship of ensembles and conservatories. The German occupiers, meanwhile, weren't interested in co-opting local elites into collaboration, like they were in Vichy France, for example. Instead, they aimed to repress the educated classes, fearful that these potential leaders could foment rebellion. As a result, all Poles, including the elites, were to be reduced to a leaderless pool of unskilled labor. Since classical composers generally belonged to the intelligentsia, a class of educated, civically minded professionals, they also became targets of repression. In addition, music itself was seen as a potential source of resistance and was heavily censored. Works that would, quote, provide the audience with an aesthetic experience, unquote, such as Polish classics or folk music, were banned. Orchestras and conservatories were also shuttered. To circumvent these restrictions, an intricate system of semi-legal concerts in cafes and clandestine performances in private apartments took root. Even musicians who pieced together a living, however, suffered immensely. Street executions and arbitrary roundups for forced labor had become everyday occurrences. Within these conditions of wartime brutality, the events that we know today as the Holocaust of the European Jews took place. From the first days of the German occupation, Jews were treated as racial inferiors, non-people. Ethnically Jewish musicians who did not escape abroad could attempt to mask their backgrounds, blend into the Polish population, or go into hiding. The remainder moved into ghettos. Sorry, I'm getting some odd audio feedback.
This is my fault, sorry.
All right. Is that just audible to me, or is okay? I think we got it. Sorry about that. The remainder moved into ghettos. The most famous of these is Władysław Szpilman, whose memoirs inspired Roman Polanski's film *The Pianist*. But at least 157 other musicians also moved to the Warsaw Ghetto, including many from ensembles like the Warsaw Philharmonic, the Radio Orchestra, and the Warsaw Quartet. The vast majority were murdered in the gas chambers of Treblinka in the summer of 1942. Between the Holocaust and the everyday terror of occupation, Poland's population was decimated. Everyone knew someone who had died, and most surviving musicians had several close calls of their own. By 1945, about 85% of central Warsaw had been reduced to ruins, as you can see in these rare color photographs from 1947. Survivors were displaced from their homes or lived permanently among the rubble. I'm going to start by talking through some of the experiences that Zygmunt Michalski had against this background of larger displacement and wartime loss. Several aspects of Michalski's identity are central to how this broader story unfolds. He would come to hold sway over post-war discussions in part because he activated long-standing beliefs about the role of the intelligentsia and nobility in Polish society. Although Michalski often downplayed his gentry background, almost all were aware of it. He was even occasionally referred to as the Count. At a time when the gentry were losing their estates, yet often transferring traditional prestige into other forms of influence, Michalski's class position amounted to a counterintuitive advantage, allowing him to be taken seriously when he spoke on behalf of Polish culture writ large. He managed to wield this influence despite being a gay man. Although he remained closeted during his lifetime, Michalski's sexuality was an open secret among the social circles of musicians and intellectuals. He lived with a partner and socialized extensively with other gay male writers and artists, as he details in his posthumously published diaries. In Poland, the social stigmas against open discussions of male homosexuality during this period allowed someone of his class and educational background to acquire power without homophobic retaliation completely derailing his career. Before the war, in the 1920s and 1930s, he more often wandered the streets of Paris than he did those of Warsaw. Quote, "A century-old tradition demonstrates to us that true talent only profits from contact with Western culture," he remarked in 1935. "We believe that basing Polish music with one leg in Paris will only benefit it." Unquote. Indeed, for the decade between 1926 and 1936, he studied composition with Nadia Boulanger, launching a friendship and epistolary exchange that lasted to her death. He also was active in the Polish musical community in the city of Paris. He served as president and treasurer of the Association of Young Polish Musicians in Paris, a collegial organization that assisted incoming musicians with finances and logistical arrangements. During the interwar years, neither Michalski nor his colleagues aimed to immigrate permanently to Paris or even to create sustainable careers abroad. Rather, they saw their international studies as serving a domestic, even nationalist agenda of building up Poland's musical culture. The Association of Polish Musicians in Paris summarized this view in its founding manifesto. Quote, "We feel that we are part of Polish society. Each of us remembers that there will come a time when we will be obligated to return to Poland in order to display the benefits that we attained abroad and to transplant them onto Polish ground." Unquote. World War II upended this world. Back in Poland, Michalski joined the army, but after the campaign against the German and Soviet invasions failed, he fled across the Hungarian border. Quote, "All that I can tell you is that I am still alive," he wrote to Boulanger a few days later. "But I don't know anything about the fate of my family and friends, of my brothers, mother, family, not to speak of everyone, of the entire country." Unquote. He soon made his way to France and joined the Polish army being assembled there. He fought during the Battle of France in summer of 1940 and was captured. For the remainder of the war, he performed forced labor in a POW camp in northern Germany. To distract and sustain himself during these 4 years, he wrote dozens of letters to Boulanger. Quote, "All the days, during the long hours of work, during the nighttime hours, I talk with you. Your conscience is a guide, your heart a force." Unquote. Michalski's earliest response to the trauma of the war was to jettison his former belief that Poland's musical culture would best be grown by elite composers traveling to Paris. At liberation, Michalski chose to return to Paris, even though he could have easily left for France instead. Quote, "I should go over there to Poland, where my mother, my brothers, my children, all my compatriots are," as he explained his decision to Boulanger. "What awaits him now? What is happening in Central Europe?" Unquote. The gravity pulling him home is understandable, but his decision also foreshadowed a long-lasting shift in his views about musicians' social responsibilities. Time and time again, Michalski explained to Boulanger how Poland's decimation meant that he and his colleagues had to serve reconstruction. Quote, "Each person, according to his strengths and means, should fight until the end. Each year, really each month, each week, even each day is a year, a month, or a day that we have won. We have won this time so that we may live, so that we may build again. All that matters is life. No one can grasp this who has not seen war from up close." Unquote. Colleagues who remained abroad or in Paris now earned his derision. Admonishing one Paris-based Polish composer, he explained, quote, "The single wise thing that I did was to return here to Poland. As a matter of fact, I never hesitated even for a moment. There is work here, and I knew that there would be when the war began. And I don't know about how things are over there where you are. I only know that we are not there, but rather we live here and will be here." If the we of Poland's musical community had once effortlessly bridged Paris and Warsaw, now, Michalski implies, it resides only among those who pull their weight in reconstruction. Acting on these beliefs, he began to devote himself to his work as a cultural official, critic, and ultimately tastemaker, while de-emphasizing his identity as a composer. He soon led the Union of Polish Composers and was an editor and widely read critic in the musical press. Any vision of music in the aftermath of war, his remarks implied, must be grounded in the immediate concerns of the here and the now. His aesthetic ideas matched this call for pragmatic action. In his early post-war writings, Michalski encouraged musicians to capitalize on a widespread hunger for musical performances in the aftermath of the war. He was far from the only commentator to notice a newfound interest in concert going. Others described overflowing concert halls and audiences who were now interested in once unpopular contemporary works. For musicians performing in front of such audiences, the hunger for music seemed only comprehensible as an effect of the war. As the soprano Ewa Bandrowska-Turska remarked in a letter, quote, "All that people live through has left its imprint on everything. It simply deepened the feeling for life as well as art, and it created another type of human. I can't explain the completely exceptional reactions of audiences in any other way." Michalski agreed with such views, writing in 1945 that during the war, art is the gateway, as in the Middle Ages, the monastery entrance was for individuals who were persecuted by physical or metaphysical violence. The imperative facing composers in his reading was to maintain their heightened sense of social relevance that the war had created. Quote, under indifference or pressure, our art, it turned out, will wither. But here in the heaviest moments, music awakens truly mass reactions, which it is necessary to maintain at any price by supplying listeners with the highest artistic qualities. Michalski's subsequent definition of these highest artistic qualities does not call for direct commemoration of the war or even an acknowledgement of his traumas. Rather, he focuses on an accessible, unifying style. Quote, we are not concerned with experimental trifles, but rather with good, honest, sincere Polish music. We are concerned with expression, which one must search for very deeply, and which must be imparted in a very straightforward manner. It is not about currying favor or quenching personal ambitions of the title author, but rather about the fact that works exist and that they go into the world without regard whether some Johnny, Stan, or Frankie wrote them. It is like with the old sculptors who did not worry themselves with signing their works, but rather about the portal, the cathedral, about the entirety of the building. These ideas would animate Michalski's thinking for the next several years, so I will linger on them here. There is a passing reference to the nation in the first sentence. It is sincere Polish music that he desires. Yet nationalism alone is insufficient. Indeed, he claims that expression is the key to sustaining audience interest in new music. But it is not the expression of an individual composer's personal point of view that matters, but rather if a composer can mobilize a more general sense of music's elemental power. There is thus a key tension in Michalski's idea. On the one hand, he promotes a romantic, individual aesthetic in which the music transmits the composer's interior world. On the other hand, he believes that the individual's ambitions will be irrelevant in this aesthetic, and that the composer must serve the collective as anonymous craftsperson instead. This tension between individuality and anonymity had roots in Michalski's observations about how his colleagues coped with the aftermath of the war. His letters to Boulanger arrived at an analogous distinction. Quote, it is not easy to speak with you about life here. One must see it, see Warsaw first and foremost, the courage and the energy of the people who are literally hanging on to the ruins in the entire country too. It is impossible to make you understand over there what has taken place here. With every step, each person carries his years in such a natural manner, and every being is a world that has endured a shipwreck. In this last clause, Michalski acknowledges the individuality and sharp divergences of wartime faiths. Yet he also asserts that few wish to focus on their individual losses, choosing instead to create an appearance of normalcy. Indeed, Michalski knew this conflict between private and public all too well. His own compositions during this time do not accord with the aesthetics he championed. They are dark and acerbic settings of text by the poet Czesław Miłosz that explore the limits of artistic agency during the war. Tellingly, he never intended these for his circulation, and they were only published after his death. We might read Michalski's aesthetic statements as an attempt to resolve this tension between individual experience and collective unification. An expressive yet non-authorial music would acknowledge the universality of wartime trauma without engaging with its loss and specificity. Perhaps this would prevent individuals from re-experiencing their own losses. Perhaps it simply avoids the difficulty of finding common ground among a multitude of divergent faiths. In any case, for Michalski, constructing an account of society-wide trauma depended on first taming and delimiting the unruly power of loss while still acknowledging its magnitude. I now want to turn to the second figure of today's talk, Roman Polester. Michalski did not cement support of other musicians for his visions alone. It was those who championed the works of Roman Polester who often played this role and who developed some of the clearest sonic analogs for his ideas. During the 1930s, Polester was a rising talent within Poland's modernist circles. He was involved with the Polish section of the International Society for Contemporary Music, an organization of composers who organized yearly festivals of new music in different cities around the globe. But he was also a prolific composer of film scores and incidental music for the theater, work that provided an important source of income. For Polester, the years of the Second World War were mainly a time of unfettered productivity and slow stylistic evolution. at least according to his memoirs and official biography. As this narrative goes, Polester began moving away from neoclassicism and instead began exploring a, quote, deepening of expression, unquote, during this period. This narrative does not overlook the material hardships he faced during these years, most notably his imprisonment in a notorious Gestapo prison for about 6 weeks. But its main focus remains on the impressive slew of compositions he finished, as you can see on the slide. I began to see what this carefully constructed narrative was hiding more or less by accident. Instead of seeing these years primarily in musical compositional terms, I began to grasp the hidden story of how his family survived the war despite their Jewish background. When reading through his correspondence in the University of Warsaw Library, I came across a cryptic reference to his stepsister in a letter sent to Roman in 1959, which the key passage is translated on the screen. Polester makes virtually no mention of his stepsister or stepfamily in any of his writings, and he seems to have destroyed their correspondence before his death. But following the thread in this letter eventually led me to a 3-hour videotaped interview with Polester's stepsister that was conducted by the USC Shoah Foundation in the early 90s. In this interview, she explains how her father, Hinrich Polester, had converted from Judaism to Catholicism as a young man. He thus counted as a Jew according to Nazi racial criterion, which would have exposed him and probably the entire family to persecution. Despite the risks the family faced because of their Jewishness, they nonetheless aided the less fortunate. Throughout the war, she explains, they hid Jewish refugees in their apartment and helped the underground ferry Jewish children from the ghetto. They did this despite being twice blackmailed by Poles who threatened to denounce the family to the Gestapo. While Roman Polester was not directly involved in these efforts, he was a frequent visitor to their apartment during the war and knew firsthand the dangers his closest family faced. By the war's conclusion, both his father and his brother were dead. Yet Roman never discussed this personal history, and few of his colleagues seemed aware of it. There were, of course, several likely reasons for this silence. Jewish survivors often did not want to discuss their experiences, sometimes because they feared anti-Semitic retribution. Others simply did not wish to revisit the past. In any case, Polester's silence about this aspect of his wartime experiences also extends to his works, which avoided any precise references to the details of the war. For example, his Requiem, begun in 1945, had a vague dedication to the victims of the war, which you can see in top in French, but he removed this from the later orchestrated version of the composition. By suppressing the musical personal details of his wartime biography, Polester helped critics who were already eager to interpret his music as a symbol of survival and cultural rejuvenation. Among the earliest of his works to fall into such a narrative was his 1943 Ogiński Poloneses. In this composition, Polester arranged Poloneses by the early Romantic composer Michał Kleofas Ogiński. The work was premiered on the inaugural concert of the State Philharmonic Orchestra in April 1945. It became one of the most widely performed compositions of his. Polester doubtlessly had earlier models of modernist rehashings in his ears, such as Stravinsky's Pulcinella. The direct impetus for the composition, however, was a commission from the underground radio for popular style compositions of a national character. Perhaps unsurprisingly given this objective, he rarely deviates from Ogiński's harmonic language. Instead, he expands the Poloneses through changes in instrumentation, including a harpsichord, which often performs a quasi-continuo part. I'm going to play an archival recording of this and note that the harpsichord is played in this recording by a piano. Is it okay or not? Is there a problem with the sound? All right, hang tight. I think I forgot to share the computer sound. Classic music instructor mistake. Let me try this again. Hold tight. All right, let's try this again. Yeah. By basing the composition on Ogiński's Poloneses, Polester evoked an earlier moment of persecution, ones that Poles and Polish identity had survived. In the late 18th century, Poland was partitioned by its neighbors and ceased to exist as a political entity. During this time, Ogiński was a diplomat and an advocate for Polish independence. His music came to reflect these tumultuous political events. As a composer, he is best remembered for introducing a melancholy cast to the stately genre of the Polonaise, thereby turning the genre into a symbol of nostalgia for the lost nation. Polester's piece reinforces these connections between Ogiński's Polonaises and national longing. Although nonetheless, he makes no direct connection to the war. Instead, he evokes the broader spectrum of national loss and rebirth. Near the end of the piece, the orchestra fades into one of the thinnest and quietest textures yet. From this clearing, we hear the harpsichord playing the first phrase of Ogiński's most famous Polonaise, Farewell to the Fatherland. And note again that you're going to hear the Polonaise being played not on a harpsichord, but on the piano because of the recording. Of all of Ogiński's Polonaises, this one perhaps most clearly evoked a sense of both personal and national loss. Sorry about that, we'll have to just move ahead. It was composed as Ogiński following the defeat of the failed uprising in 1794 and as Ogiński was immigrating from the country. In Polester's arrangement, the harpsichord stands as a symbol for the sounds of a long past era. It is as if a memory of this earlier time emerges frail and ghost-like from the contemporary arrangement. For the critic Stefan Kisielewski, an editor of Poland's most important musical journal at the time, Polester's turn to old musical sources presented a riddle. Quote, what does Polester, a radical and transigent modernist tank, have to do with the composer of dated, naive, old-fashioned, and melodious Polonaises, he wondered. In a review the following week on the screen, he answered his own question. This work has its own symbolic significance. Antique Polonaises, transformed by a contemporary modernist, are an ark of the covenant between the old and new years. It is a manifestation of the continuity of our culture, lasting above the war and the cataclysms that befell it, of a culture that was able to withstand all persecutions, endure, and be for us a true, non-material, yet no less real fatherland, the spiritual fatherland, unquote. At first glance, this might appear a rather large claim depend on a modest arrangement of Polonaises, but Kisielewski's views here powerfully connect new music to long-standing beliefs about the power of culture to define the nation. Most prominently, the phrase Ark of the Covenant between the old and new years is allusion to Konrad Wallenrod, an epic in verse by Adam Mickiewicz, Poland's most canonized romantic poet. The epic is set in the distant past and portrays Lithuanian treachery against the Teutonic Knights. But from its publication in 1828 onward, it was seen as an allegory of Polish survival under partition. Kisielewski's allusion to these lines is especially significant because the original passage discussed the power of song to awaken the hero to the defense of the nation. In Kisielewski's view, the national symbols are important, but more powerful is that music could create the ways that music could ground Polish culture in a foundation, one that remained stable despite the multiple cataclysms that befell the nation. Most of Polester's wartime music, however, did not operate within this symbolic realm. But even in works in absolute genres like the symphony or concerto soon came to exemplify a post-war desire for emotional expressibility and accessibility whose roots we explored with Michalski. One critic believed that Polester had abandoned matter-of-fact music and embraced a style that he could only describe as romantic. Even as he cautioned, the word romanticism is an improvised label for indisputable newness, which could be the beginning of a new musical style of our era. Such criticism often focused on works that Polester had completed during the war, and especially on his large-scale compositions. To gain a sense of the musical stakes of this discussion, I'd like us to listen to an excerpt from his Violin Concerto, completed in 1941. Notice here how Polester stretches the dimensions of the melodic phrase as it gains in intensity in its pass between the orchestra and soloist. It is as if the soloist and orchestra build off of one another as the full force of the orchestra is progressively mobilized. Kieślowski elevated Polester's emotional and expressive aesthetic, like we've heard here, painting it as the most promising direction for contemporary music writ large. Writing after a festival that premiered many wartime works, he dismissed most of the music that he had heard, but he put Polester above many others. Quote, "There is a striving for a new monumentality, for a greatness of construction, encompassing a charge of emotionality in his works. This expression, however, employs thoroughly contemporary means. The goal of these works is not experimentation exclusively. Rather, they desire to rehabilitate themselves and justify their existence precisely by the creation of a new emotionality and a new greatness, not only through the new shivers, like with the Impressionists or even people of Stravinsky's time wanted." Unquote. This description expands several of Michalski's earlier points. Not only do both Kieślowski and Michalski value emotion, but they also believe that these values will justify the existence of contemporary music to a war-wearied audience. I propose we attempt to hear Polester's wartime works from this perspective. We might interpret their grandeur and expression as a subtle acknowledgement of wartime circumstances in which they are conceived, but also a gesture outside and beyond those conditions. Let me spend a couple minutes still just to wrap up some of the main themes from this talk. By the late 1950s, Polester had largely been forgotten as a composer. He immigrated from Poland and eventually found work as a broadcaster for Radio Free Europe in Munich. Michalski, meanwhile, continued to work with and alongside the Polish state through the 1950s. Following the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, however, his writings began to address the political questions at the heart of the opposition to state socialism. Even as Polester faded from the musical scene, however, his aesthetic had an unexpected staying power. By the early 1950s, emotional expression had become a key element of Polish socialist realism. In 1950, for example, Michalski told the yearly Congress of Polish Composers that realism in music depended on, quote, simplifying musical language, on a deepening of emotional expression. Such statements drew a direct line between Michalski's earliest post-war writings and his advocacy for socialist realism, and were part of a larger trend of defining socialist realism through a familiar and well-established post-war discourse. Even after the mid-1950s, when socialist realism was no longer de rigueur, the values of emotion, expressivity, and communication continued to hold an outside prestige in Poland's musical circles. When Polish surrealist composers of the 1960s saw performances at the Warsaw Autumn, their works were performed at the Warsaw Autumn. Their works were evaluated in terms of emotionality and communicability. Similar values informed Witold Lutosławski's concerns for sensuous expression. The lyrical, tempered modernism of Tadeusz Baird and Andrzej Panównik explored similar terrains, but perhaps no work better delivered this aesthetic to audiences worldwide than Henryk Górecki's Third Symphony. By the late 1980s, such unapologetically emotional works were part of a broader international trend. While composers in Western Europe and the US turned to expression as a rejection of the austere aesthetics of Darmstadt, composers in Poland had been exploring similar terrain for nearly 4 decades. It would be inaccurate, of course, to essentialize all of Poland's expressive musical works. In some cases, these later composers had little direct knowledge of early post-war aesthetics. Yet we might also hear their decade-long commitment to emotionality as a reflection of the unacknowledged influence of early post-war discourse. In the few years following the war, composers and critics had established high stakes for new music. Their values of expression and closeness to the audience were not merely stylistic, but it also performed vital cultural work of unification and rejuvenation. If composers continued to grapple with similar ideas for years to come, it was because the likes of Michalski, Kieślowski, and Polester had cemented powerful assumptions about what new music could accomplish and why it mattered. Thank you. I think we have some time left for the question and answer session, so I'll turn it over to Johannes to guide us through that, and hang with me while I unshare my screen here.
Very much, Mackenzie, for this panorama and for introducing us to these figures who, at least to me, were not familiar. I'm sure there's some people in our audience who know them much better, and I look forward to hearing from experts as well as non-experts in the audience. As we said, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A, and I'll bring them up there from there. If it's not exactly in the order in which they come in, rest assured, I'll try to get to all of them. We've got a fair bit of time. We can go until 1:20. That's the time allotted to these lectures, but we can be flexible about how many questions there are. So I'll I'll lob some at you. I've got my own that I'd love to ask, but I'll let the audience go first. There's a question from Arthur Mangozi here in Greece, who thanks you for your presentation and asks, are there parallels in expressions of the Polish nation or nationalism between the writings and works of post-war Polish composers and those of composers living in the interwar or even partition era Poland? So I guess it's a historical question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the Ogiński Poloneses, Pez's example is one answer to that question, right? The idea that music was a powerful means of expressing cultural identity in the absence of a state is very much ingrained in the thinking of Polish musicians in the 19th century. So Chopin played a pretty crucial role there, for example, in establishing the mazurka as a sort of symbol of Polish nationality. But he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of other composers working in a similar terrain. Broadly speaking, music had certain advantages in that, right? It didn't have obvious linguistic content, so it made it a bit, it allowed audiences to read their own significances into it. At the same time, it allowed representations of the folk and of the nation to be presented and to be publicized. So that's in a way the background to much of what composers are up to during the Second World War in Poland. They're certainly responding to these much deeper tropes about how the nation had survived previous moments of upheaval. And you see that very clearly in Polester, but he's certainly not the only one. I mean, even more direct connection is that there is a very strong trend of performing Chopin in clandestine concerts in people's apartments. His music was, for the most part, banned from the cafes or for the public stage, although the regulations on that were very complicated. But nonetheless, he was frequently performed on these underground venues where his sort of patriotic and nationalist sentiments were well known. I'm happy to speak to the interwar period as well. So the larger project from which this talk is drawn is a book project that really goes from the mid-1920s until the mid-1950s. So the war plays a pivotal role in that history, of course, but I'm more interested in the kinds of broader narratives that persisted despite what seems to be the massive ruptures of this event. And in the interwar period in Poland, you have an incredible focus at the time on building up musical culture from the ground up. This is very much a sort of positivist-oriented way of thinking about musical culture. We have to go out to the provinces, we have to go out to the people, whatever that means, and bring them the high art of musical culture, right? There's a lot of pretty complex ideologies that are involved in that in the 1920s and 1930s, and if you're curious about more of that, you can come to my ACES paper in a couple of weeks where I'll talk about that in more detail. But in general, then there is after the war, the First World War, that is, there's a moment among modernist composers that Poland needs to be put on the map musically. And the main figure leading this push is Karol Szymanowski, the great modernist Polish composer, who encourages his young followers to turn to Paris. And he thinks that Chopin is this model for how Polish music can be both national in character, yet somehow speak to broader kind of universal themes. And by universal, he means more or less Western Europe. So there is certainly this, in a way, that is a reaction to both the regaining of statehood at the end of the First World War, and also more broadly, the upheaval of the First World War. I mean, basically every musician who's of significance in the 1920s and 30s was somehow displaced by the conflict of the First World War. And there's this incredible pressure in this period to sort of build up a sense of Polish music in response to both statehood and to this broader sense of dislocation. But the crucial distinction from the post-war period is that in the interwar period, so after World War I, that energy, that response is really directed outwards towards France, especially, and it's directed much less towards the kind of rhetoric you get in Michalski, where you're trying to cut off contact with the outside world.
Maybe I can follow up with a very quick question of my own there, which is, I mean, you mentioned the Paris connection, which seems pretty constant and important biographically and musically. What about connections inside the Soviet bloc when it emerges? And maybe I could link that to a question about the Polester violin concerto, which struck me, I mean, I'm not a musicologist, but it struck me as I was listening to it and looking at the dates, 1939 to 41, it's composed as unexpectedly big. And then you actually had the quotes from the critic who speaks about monumentality, you speak about grandeur. And I wonder how that, whether that's something that gets picked up. I mean, you briefly mentioned the socialist realist aesthetic that emerges and kind of dominates for a bit, but is this monumentality, which one wouldn't expect in, in the year the war breaks out, that musicians would turn, or composers would turn to a monumental aesthetic when everything's being bombed to bits, essentially. So I'm just curious whether that resonates within the, like, if you look across the border also to East Germany or to the Soviet experience that they're trying to figure out.
Yeah, sure. Those are great questions. I'll take those. I'll deal with the Soviet bloc question first, because I think in some ways it's simpler. This talk was kind of grounded in Warsaw in a certain way and grounded in the experience of German occupation. But a lot of composers found themselves, in fact, under Soviet occupation. They were in this occupied Lvov at the time, or otherwise found sanctuary in the Soviet Union. So they're either in parts of Poland that were then occupied by the Soviet Union, or they also fled deeper into the USSR. And those people, when they returned to Poland, became some of the main connectors to this kind of Soviet system, if you will. One of the most important figures in this story is the musicologist Zofia Lisa, who is a Polish Jew from Lvov. She ended up going to Moscow and Uzbekistan during the war. But there she was a Marxist before the war. She was very much a leftist, but during the war, she kind of came to understood what the Soviet system in practice was like. And she wasn't the only one. Mieczysław Drobny, the son of Bolesław Drobny, the important socialist activist, also ended up in the USSR and comes back and runs the Department of Music within the Ministry of Culture from 1944 on. So many of the people who were in exile in the USSR in the war come back and play important roles in founding the institutions of the Soviet state. So they have a certain experience with what it means to be a Soviet musician firsthand. Now, in some ways, the experience of Soviet music during the war is in fact an exception from what came before it and came backwards. It's a period of considerable cultural liberalism. So even these people who knew the Soviet system firsthand are often surprised in 1948 or 1949 when the Stalinist system in Poland is fully unfurled, if you will, comes to a head. So they certainly have lots of contacts into the East, but most composers at the time have a relatively naive or just very ignorant understanding of what's going on musically in the USSR. They know that there's oppression, that Shostakovich had a run-in after 1936, but beyond that, they don't really know all that much. So there is this period from 1945 until 1948 or so when there's a bit of an attitude of kind of anything goes. They're getting a lot of money from the state. There's a lot of state support, but the sort of ideological follow-through is not really that important or not really that prominent. And the ideological points that the state is pushing are fairly uncontroversial. Things like we need to bring music to more people, right? That's a project that almost all composers can support because it's ultimately bolsters their own prestige and status, right? That begins to change around 1948, 1949. On the question of monumentality and grandeur, I mean, that was in some ways the question that began this particular chapter, this particular research question. Why would you turn to this kind of music? I mean, the kind of the dominant, if you will, the sort of the musicological narratives we often tell our undergraduates about the wars, both the First and the Second War, are that these are moments of retreat from expression, right? It's the end of the old order, it's the fall of the bourgeoisie, it's the fall of all these concert institutions, and that means that instead composers are done with expression, they're done with emotionality. You have people like Pierre Boulez in 1950 composing works that are almost entirely machine-like in their orientation, right? And I was sort of struck that this was very much a sort of Western Europe and American, the US narrative of how the wars played out, and that was very different from what was going on in Poland. I do think around this time you do get you do get some similar examples of this in East Germany, for example. There are some works written sort of like these sort of rune works, if you will, about the kind of experience of loss that are also sort of grand in scale and make similar references back to a past, often drawing on Protestant church music and things like that. So there, I mean, I think this is certainly a strand of reaction to the war that's going on in this place outside of Poland, but it is particularly kind of noteworthy in Poland at the time.
Great, thanks. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just going to go through them, and I'm going to ask the person who asked the first question for patience, because I'm going to save it for last, because it's the COVID question, which I think is really important and interesting.
Okay.
But it always seems to me that might be a good one to end on. So Daniel Zeldana, who's an undergraduate student here, asks, what were the causes that these composers' music were vastly forgotten, as well as what was the sentiment outside of the Polish composers of the style of aesthetics, as in Germany, where there was a trend to serialism that greatly excluded the notions of expressivity and individualism. I guess that's what we just talked about.
Yeah, getting it.
Was this musical aesthetic welcomed by the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Daniel. Thank you. Why do these composers fade into obscurity is a kind of complicated question that that has to do both with their individual choices and responses to state socialism and also the broader aesthetic trends of this period. So Polester's case is fairly easy to account for. He leaves Poland in about 1947, bases himself in Paris, thinks he's going to be able to make it work, more or less. Realizes that isn't feasible. In 1951, writes a couple of articles that are sort of recycling ideas from Czesław Miłosz's The Captive Mind. They're sort of in that similar vein. He's hanging out with the Kultura crowd in Paris at the time, and breaks with the government of Poland, and then gets a job for Radio Free Europe. So he ends up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, if you will, on the sort of Western side. So there's no he comes back to Poland a couple of times during his lifetime. His works get performed sometimes here and there, but there's really anyone who advocates for his works takes considerable risks. So for example, one student got a scholarship to go to study in Paris, I think in the 60s or 70s, and interviewed him and published a big article about an interview with Polester. And then, if you go to the Institute of National Memory, you can find the secret the interrogation protocols from this. This was enough to arouse the kind of the interest of the authorities and led to a travel ban on the student for quite some years, I believe. So there were sort of material risks for engaging with this music, especially that of Polester's during this period. I think the other main reason is the rise of the composers most commonly associated with the Warsaw Autumn and their paradoxically enough, incredible success on the world stage. So I have in mind people here like Witold Lutosławski, Krzysztof Penderecki, to some degree Panufnik, and a little bit later Henryk Górecki, who I mentioned at the end of the talk. These composers drew on many of the sort of Western serialist elements of this time in the 1950s and 1960s, and were incredibly for new music, popular in the West. And they had the institution of the Warsaw Autumn, which is a kind of a meeting point for East and West composers of considerable stature there to often promote their works. So someone like Lutosławski was very much invested in seeing the period from 1945 until 1956 as one of repression. So he was nonetheless writing mass songs and working for the radio in this period. He was very much involved in it. But if you look at his writings from after that period, he very much sees 1949 as this kind of crushing down of the state on the composers, even though the more recent scholarly work of scholars in this field have suggested it wasn't that straightforward. So these composers perpetuated this view that this period wasn't as interesting, and that the composers associated it weren't kind of worthy of the same attention. And once you die and there's no one there to kind of look after your works or your legacy, it becomes very hard to re-enter the canon. So that's the sort of status that they ended up with at the end of the day.
Thank you. I'm going to try and combine three questions that take us east again to Russia and the Soviet Union. The first one is from, so you might want to take notes.
Okay, let me write this down.
And I hope it makes sense to combine these, but we'll see. So the first one is from Twyla Tardif, who asks, how did musicians and composers educated in the Russian Imperial Academy system affect the interwar and post-World War II attempts to claim identity? Were they sidelined or emigrated or part of the conversation? And thank you for such a wonderful talk. And then Misha Krutikov from the Slavic department asks, was Mieczysław Weinberg's music known and performed in Poland after 45? And more generally, his question is on the connection between Soviet composers, first of all, Shostakovich and Poland. And the third Soviet Russia question is from Sam Brazil in Greece, who thanks you for your presentation and asks, how would you characterize Michalski's attitude toward officially lauded composers, Soviet composers, like, again, Shostakovich, Khachaturian, et cetera, and their music? I ask about him specifically because of his career as a critic.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, the Russian Imperial Academy question is an interesting one. I mean, it's certainly the sense I get of the interwar period is that it is a sense of rupture. The First World War is a sense of rupture in the lives of these musicians. It's not necessarily obvious at the time that this is even necessarily a positive thing, right? There's a real desire afterwards to read back the regaining of independence is a great moment in Polish musical history, but at the time most of them are kind of displaced and trying to figure out their lives. My sense is that particular experience didn't figure particularly strongly in that period. There certainly were people who were educated in that system, just as there were ones who were also educated in the German schools or in Warsaw, but the sort of sense of it being sort of setting up standards or ideas that had to be contested wasn't particularly prominent in that discourse at the time. What does come to the fore, though, is a real focus on creating institutions of musical education in Poland proper that will match the qualities of those elsewhere in the world. So there's kind of these endless debates about reforming the Warsaw Conservatory, right? Is it going to have 3 different levels, or is it going to have 1 level, or is it a kind of music school for virtuosi, or is it a music school for other people? And those are very much wrapped up in this question of how do we produce a population that's musical, right? So there is a real interest in education, but it tends to be more forward-looking rather than backward-looking into the era of the partition. So the second and third question, so about Weinberg and Shostakovich et al. And sort of Michalski's views on them. Weinberg is an interesting character, of course. I would say he's surprisingly marginal in the sources of the interwar period and the war. I mean, he gets out, he has this fantastic friendship with Shostakovich, and he is quite a prolific composer in the Soviet Union, but there aren't the same sort of personal ties between him and the other figures who rise to power in this early post-war period that there were with some of the other exiles in the Soviet Union who came back to Poland. And my sense is that it's much later that there's a kind of interest in exploring or claiming his music. So Michalski on Shostakovich, there's a great article, a great piece of criticism by Michalski about the Shostakovich Leningrad Symphony, which is of course this sort of a microfilm is taken out of the Soviet Union of this work, and it becomes this sort of global hit, if you will. And Michalski hears this work performed, I think, in Krakow or outside of Krakow in the early post-war period. And there are, Soviet soldiers in attendance. And he says, wow, this is a real indication of the power of Soviet culture, that these soldiers are interested in this music and that this music is created for him. So he is, in many ways, quite amenable to the idea that the Soviet influence over Poland will help improve the kind of average quality of the concert goer in the country, right? This is not a particularly controversial idea. In fact, fits quite nicely into the intelligentsia's own self-conception of these composers, right? That they are the sort of leaders and elite, and they need to bring up the people to their standards. That they don't really have much problem with that idea. They only begin to have a problem when they're told to compose, or then there's a sort of discussion about how they should be composing. I mean, and Michalski's own compositional aesthetic fits somewhat well with Shostakovich. Michalski has much more problems with the composers of the Warsaw Autumn period, like Penderecki and the like. I mean, he even kind of admits that this is music that he can't really wrap his mind around, right? And that his own compositions don't really sound all that much like that in a certain way. But by the sort of 60s, a lot of the figures I'm talking about today who do stay in Poland do see themselves as being somewhat sidelined or in the background. I mean, they nonetheless hold this sort of prestige and power behind the scenes. And someone like Michalski holds on to that for much of his life, but kind of aesthetically, he's seen as being a bit out of step by that slightly later period.
Great, thanks. Brian Porter Shush asks, the project of nation building or rebuilding after World War II is obviously a central theme of every aspect of Polish culture in the 20th century. But were there composers in the time period you're looking at who were trying to push back against this nation-centered worldview?
That is a fantastic question. I think the short answer might be no. In that there are, of those who remain in Poland, there is such this kind of Michalskian belief that the project of nation building is fundamental to what's going on, that there are very few who remain in Poland who subscribe to that view. I think the exceptions to that, though, are the people who emigrate after the war. And I would even include, to some degree, maybe a bit of Polester into this. I mean, he certainly has this kind of sense of nation building as being critical, but he also, I mean, there's great correspondence between him and the publisher of the head of the Polish music publishers, in which the Polish music publisher says, you're not doing your duty. You need to be back here helping the country build up from the destruction of war, and you're off in Paris, essentially having fun. I mean, he wasn't having fun really, but that's the narrative, right? And Polester says, well, no, I'm doing my art, right? I'm doing the music that I set out to do, and I am continuing in the model laid forth by the interwar years, which is that I can continue to be Polish and continue to be in Paris. And for a number of reasons, that doesn't prove to be sustainable for him. People like Anton Szałowski also fall into that camp. So in fact, the letter I quote from Michalski, in which he says, we are here, we are not there, I don't know what's going on there, but basically you don't belong anymore. That's written to Antoni Szałowski, who also decided to stay abroad in Paris and to sort of take this view of, of he's going to continue composing in the style that began before the war. So those people tend to fall off the face of this discourse, in part because their continued belief in the international and internationalist foundations of musical culture in the interwar period puts them out of line of a lot of the sort of thinking that people like Michalski are up to. Yeah, so I wouldn't want to sort of, you're right that it is a primary and dominant concern of those in Poland at the time, but there are some who fall out of it, but they also, the cost of not holding those beliefs are very high at this time.
I'm going to see if we can pick up there with a question from Jingjing Wan, who's in the music school. Who's, I take it, asking a question about the relationship between nation and musical form. So the question is, after hearing the recording examples you just played in the presentation, one of them shows a very distinctive feature of Polonaise rhythm, but the other one seems hard to identify as Polish nationalism at work in music. I wonder, how did the aspects of Polish nationalism in music change after World War II? Yeah,
that's a good question. I mean, talking about music and nationalism in this period is a whole kettle of worms. Is that the right expression? A can of worms. And there are these sort of clear musical indications of it in the Poloneses, for example. I mean, that's a sort of clear gesture towards it. I think, though, I mean, part of what we're seeing in this period is a sense that nationalism is being filtered through ideas about reconstruction, about building the country up, which sort of gets to the question from Brian that I just addressed, right? Sure, there are all these symbols traditionally associated with the Polish nationhood that do show up in this music, but there's also a sense that the national good, if you will, is now served by a focus on musical culture in slightly wider perspective, a slightly wider panorama. So you get an almost, I mean, sort of references to the nation and nationalism become almost, every article you read will have something along those lines in it. So I sort of identifying examples of them talking about the cause of the nation just becomes very woven into the discourse in this period. Almost everyone is talking about those terms, but that's sort of, and that's in comparison to much earlier in the 19th century when sort of ideas of cultural nationalism were still being developed and promoted. So there's a sense in which it just becomes the reference point for everything that's going on. And then the question is not so much how does this music exemplify a nationalist cause, but what kind of aesthetic or what kind of national community is being implied by these writers and by their compositions.
Yeah, thanks. So there's two more questions, and I think I'll close the Q&A at that point. Anna Tanelski, who's a grad student in Greece, is thanking you very much for your presentation and is asking what set Polish music in this period apart from other nations also experiencing the chaos caused by war, can be compared to other national music of the time, for example, Albanian or Czech compositions. Do you think Polish composers were more successful in their expression of cultural identity than others?
Oh, okay. So I want to make clear that this talk is not supposed to be Polish exceptionalist in any way. There's a lot of great work being done comparing the case of Poland more broadly to elsewhere in the country, and I think that's important. If you want to see an example of that in music, you can look at David Tompkins' comparison of music in Poland and East Germany from 1948 to the late 50s. So I don't really want to sort of, my grounding in this particular place in time does not mean that I think that Poland was the only place going through these events, or that Poland was somehow unique or different or much less superior than that going on elsewhere. Nonetheless, there are differences in the way that the kind of country has responded. The most common ones that get talked about in the discipline of musicology are those in Germany and in France and in Western Europe more broadly. I alluded to this a bit at the end of the talk, or maybe I cut it from the intro, but the common thing that musicologists generally talk about in the aftermath of the Second World War is this move away from expression and towards the aesthetics of serialism. So they take from the Second Viennese School the kind of organization of pitch that Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg were exploring with, but apply that kind of organization to more and more different parameters of the musical work. And this is often interpreted as a kind of rejection of expression and a rejection of the possibility of emotion. And that's seen as a reaction to the war. It's very closely connected to the experiences of the war across the continent, and in Germany, especially to the search for usable traditions after the period of Nazi rule. And what goes on in Poland is very different from that, I think, is it's clear here from the talk, right? There's not this serialism is not part of the discussion really at all until a few years in, and even then its position is relatively moderate. And the idea that you could reject, like the rejection of emotion is a value, just would be a non-starter for most people in this discussion, in this critical universe. So I do think that there's kind of role here for seeing Poland as being different but distinct from others that are along the way. And if you have ideas about how this is playing out in Albania, I'd love to hear them.
Thanks. So I'm gonna thank Minji Kim for her patience and get to the COVID question.
Okay.
And I'll say that Minji writes, I'm not expecting any prophetic answer, but more based on your observation of post-World War II. Here comes the question. It's interesting how the war influenced the composers. This might not be a directly related question, but how do you think the compositions will be changed after the COVID-19 pandemic? I can expect a lot of similar sentiments, such as the loss of close ones. But we may face a little different environment because it seems like many parts of the music industry will be collapsed, the bankruptcy of orchestras and venues, etc. Do you think that will affect composers to write more tonal and comfortable music to draw more audiences? A new era of neoclassicism. How do you expect the audience's reception to be different than the one after World War II? Which I guess is another way of saying, how does music respond to trauma? You've analyzed it, you're the expert. Tell us what to expect.
What a hard question. I mean, they tell you in graduate school when you're doing history or historical studies that predict the future with caution, right? So anyways, prepare for this to be like totally wrong. But I do think it's an interesting thought exercise. And I will have to say one that has occurred to me many times over these last 8 months as I've thinking it through. Obviously, in a lot of ways, these are really different events, and it's very hard to compare the kind of loss of life and trauma of the war was much greater than what we're experiencing today. But I think at the core of it, there's a sense in a lot of the writings about music in occupied Warsaw that music in this experience during this time of great persecution could play a function of unification and of bringing people together. I mean, that's to some degree a kind of trite observation, right? I mean, that's something people throw around about art all the time, and I don't, want to put that much stake into it. But it does become very much kind of lived in this period. That the communities that are founded around music are very important to the composers and very essential for them to survive. And you have examples of performances in the cafes of Warsaw having audiences like no one could have ever imagined, and people thinking that hearing chamber music is somehow a very important activity when no one had done that before the war. So there's this kind of upset of the values that occurs during the war that paradoxically, at least in the views of musicians, tends to promote the importance of their art. And I do see some parallels to that in what's happening today, in that we can't leave the house. So what do? We watch Netflix, we listen to all these great free streaming events, we engage with the very rich media that are available to us today. So there is that sort of sense that art becomes a way of sustaining us. But the other key difference in the idea of a pandemic is that it strikes at the very sense of closeness, community, and interrelation that these composers were celebrating through music at the time. I mean, there's often an assumption built into what Tchaikovsky and Polester are doing that the music itself is a form of unification, or the music itself is able to close chasms that had earlier existed, and that the music can do that. And today we're sort of stuck with the reality of isolation and distance, and even events like this. I mean, it's wonderful to hear all of your questions and to sort of hear your voices echo through the chat, right? But it's very different from imagining a kind of an intimate gathering of people listening to Chopin at the time, and really any kind of art. And that brings me to my last question, which is that the musical infrastructure of Poland could only be rebuilt by a massive infusion of cash and effort. And I think, the COVID pandemic will leave us with a similar situation, and it ultimately falls to the institutions that exist in our country and the state to help them. I don't really see any other, any lesson more clearly to draw from this discourse about reconstruction.
Amen. Is it the music school that's putting together a pandemic playlist right now I've seen this floating around. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking that there's attempts to make sense of the pandemic through culture. And I'm going to use this also as a plug for an event that we're planning for the very beginning of December, December 2nd, in this time slot, where we've gotten some really interesting people together from Moscow, Paris, Washington, and Ann Arbor, to talk about collecting COVID or curating COVID. What does it mean to actually take stock of the present with a view toward the future? Like, where are we? If we want to create an archive, if we want to help a future be able to access us as an archive, what will we put in it? And so I hope some of you will come back and bring suggestions for musical components of that archive. I'd also like to invite you before that back to our next Crease Noon lecture, which is on November 18th, when Benjamin Paloff will talk about Someone Else's Problems, his title, The Dissident Author Post-Dissidence. And I'd like to use this forum to invite everybody, encourage everybody to attend the upcoming 27th Ann Arbor Polish Film Festival, which is going to be happening next week from November 6th to 8th at the Michigan Theater, and for which actually Benjamin Paloff and I were able to record an interview with the filmmaker Agnieszka Holland. That's going to be part of the festival, and that was a very enjoyable interview to tape, and I hope it's as enjoyable and interesting for you to follow. Finally, for those interested in CREASE and the MEARS program, this might be of relevance, especially the undergraduates in the audience, that on November 2nd at 11 a.m., we'll have an informational webinar on the Masters in International and Regional Studies program with Charlie Polinko. So that's of a slightly different nature. That's it for the plugs from here. Much more importantly, I want to thank you, Mackenzie, for this talk and the really fascinating add-on of all the thoughts you shared in the Q&A, which took me in lots of directions that I hope I'll explore in other places. Again, very, very interesting. And I'm delighted to have you as an associate of CREASE and the Weiser Centers and as a colleague at Michigan. Welcome to Michigan.
Thank
Since
you.
it's still your first year, I guess. I hope to see you soon. And thanks to the audience for your participation and your questions.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.